At 9 o'clock, on February 19th, 1945, a young Marine corporal named Tony Stein pressed himself into a shallow dip in the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima. On paper, the shoreline looked like a clean landing area. In reality, it was a killing zone. Machine gun bursts and mortar impacts rolled across the beach in waves, and the terraces above were alive with hidden firing points. The island was small, but it had been engineered into a fortress. Tunnels, reinforced positions, and overlapping fields of fire designed to punish every step forward. Stein was 23. He wasn't famous, and he wasn't trying to be. What he had was a habit. He noticed bottlenecks, and he hated leaving them unsolved. On that morning, the bottleneck wasn't courage. It was momentum. Marines were pinned down because they couldn't see what was shooting at them. The defenders had built pillboxes and bunkers so carefully into the terrain that even when the firing started, all you might catch was a thin, dark slit in rock and sand. Tanks were supposed to break openings, but the ash-like ground swallowed heavy vehicles and ruined traction. Naval fire could shake the island, but it couldn't reliably erase targets that spotters couldn't clearly identify. Stein understood the brutal math. You can't push forward if your firepower can't move with you. A machine gun is powerful, but only when it's where it needs to be. Standard ground guns could dominate a sector, yet they were still built around a set-up-and-hold rhythm. Crews would deploy, engage, then lose precious time packing up and relocating. On open terrain, maybe that delay is survivable. On Iwo Jima's exposed slopes, it was the difference between taking ground and stalling out under crossfire. This idea didn't arrive out of nowhere. Earlier training had already shown Stein the same problem in a safer setting. Squads would move, the gun would lag behind, and by the time it arrived, the chance to keep pressure on the enemy had evaporated. On Iwo Jima, there was no safety margin. If the assault slowed, defenders had time to re-aim, reposition, and tighten the trap. Before the war, Stein wasn't a weapons inventor in the dramatic sense. He was a tool maker, a person who understands metal, fit, alignment, and what happens when something gets stressed the wrong way. That background gave him a different kind of confidence. He didn't need a perfect workshop to build something functional. He needed the right parts, a clear goal, and a design that wouldn't fail under abuse. And he had a clear goal: create a gun that could keep up with an assault, not just support it from behind. He looked at what was available. In the Pacific, crashed or damaged aircraft were everywhere. They were also a source of tough, well-made components, especially weapons and mounts designed to be compact and reliable. Aircraft machine guns were built to fire hard, fast, and for long bursts. The real issue was deployment. Air guns weren't made to be carried like infantry weapons. They needed a frame, a handle, a way to aim, and some method to move with the squad. Stein's answer was as practical as it was risky. He would take an aircraft machine gun and turn it into something a man could carry and operate on the ground. Fast enough to shift positions repeatedly, heavy enough to matter, and simple enough to survive sand, heat, and constant recoil. By the time the assault hit Iwo Jima, he had already done it. What he carried that day was not standard issue, and it wasn't pretty. It was a custom rig built from scavenged aircraft parts and field-made supports, an improvised weapon system designed around one obsession: mobility. If he could bring automatic fire forward, he could open space for riflemen to breathe, move, and finish the job. The moment the ramps dropped and Marines poured into the sand. Stein didn't wait for the battlefield to settle. It never would. He moved as soon as there was a pocket of cover, scanning the slopes for the telltale flicker of muzzle blasts. His plan wasn't to stand and duel the island. His plan was to hit hard, shift, hit again, and keep the enemy guessing. Because confusion was the only advantage you could manufacture on a beach with nowhere to hide. Within minutes, the beach became a test of nerve and improvisation. And Stein had brought his own answer to both. Stein's first minutes on the island were a blur of movement and decision-making. The beach offered almost no real cover, just shallow dips, scattered debris, and the bodies of wrecked landing craft. What protection existed came from staying low and never staying still. Around him, squads tried to find lanes forward, but every attempt to stand and push up the slope triggered immediate fire from positions that seemed to appear out of the ground. He did what he had built his weapon to do. He brought automatic fire forward, not as a static support from the rear, but as a moving pressure point. When a burst from a hidden slit pinned a group, Stein angled his improvised gun toward the source and laid down a controlled stream, long enough to force heads down and buy seconds. Seconds were everything. A squad didn't need a miracle. Just a brief pause in incoming fire to crawl, pull someone back, or reach the next patch of cover. The difference was immediate. Riflemen who had been frozen in place could move. Marines began inching around obstacles they'd been stuck behind. A few yards gained on that beach wasn't just distance. It was proof that the attack could still function. But mobility came with a cost. Ammunition. A machine gun that moves fast also burns through belts fast, and Stein knew he couldn't keep doing this without resupply. Most gunners would stay in place and wait for ammo to arrive. Stein didn't. He ran back. The run wasn't dramatic in the Hollywood way. It was ugly and practical, head down, zigzagging through the chaos, memorizing landmarks that barely existed. He reached the supply point, grabbed ammunition, and turned right back toward the front. Then he did it again, and again. Each trip was a calculated gamble. The longer you stayed without ammo, the more you risked losing the tiny opening you'd created. Yet each trip also exposed him to the same open terrain that had already swallowed so many men. Stein didn't treat it like heroism. He treated it like logistics. If the gun stopped, the advance stopped. If the advance stopped, more people would be hit while trapped in the open. So he made himself into the link between firepower and forward movement. On one of those returns, he found a group clustered behind minimal cover, trying to reorganize after losing contact with another element. The men were shaken, less from fear than from sensory overload. Smoke, noise, and confusion made everything feel unreal. Stein didn't lecture them. He didn't make speeches. He simply set his gun, sent a short burst toward a firing point that had been snapping at them, and pointed to the next line of cover. Now. That was enough. Slowly, the beach began to change. It was still deadly, still chaotic, but the movement stopped being random. It became directional. A few squads started to push beyond the worst of the shoreline and onto the lower slopes. The defenders were still hidden, but they were no longer completely unchallenged. Every time Stein's gun spoke, it forced a choice. Keep firing and risk being exposed, or pause and give the Marines a chance to move. As the morning stretched on, another crisis stacked on top of ammo. casualties. Men who made it forward were being pulled back, sometimes only a few feet at a time, because the terrain made even evacuation difficult. In the middle of this, Stein found himself switching roles without thinking about it. He would fire to cover movement, then help drag a wounded Marine to safer ground, then sprint for more ammunition, then return to the line. This pattern, pressure, movement, resupply, evacuation, became his rhythm. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't safe, but it was effective. Other Marines began to recognize him, not as an individual doing something wild, but as a stabilizing point in a battlefield that had very few. When his gun was active, people could breathe and coordinate. When he returned with ammunition, crews could keep functioning. When he helped pull someone back, it kept the unit from breaking apart under stress. By midday, the assault had advanced enough that targets were still hard to see but easier to infer. You might not spot the bunker, but you could identify the angles of fire. You could feel which ridgeline had become the main problem. Stein used those clues like a craftsman uses measurements. Not perfect, but good enough to build an answer. He wasn't alone in this. Many men were doing extraordinary things across the beach. The difference was that Stein's extraordinary looked like repetition, a mission performed over and over until it became a system. He wasn't gambling on one heroic moment. He was building momentum, one run and one burst at a time. And on Iwo Jima, momentum was the only thing that could turn the landing from a slaughter into a foothold. As the hours passed, the beach behind Stein stayed crowded with new waves of Marines, supplies, and wounded men being pulled back. Ahead, the island rose in harsh steps, ridges, broken rock, and angles that turned every approach into a shooting gallery. The defenders didn't need to win a fair fight. They only needed to keep the attackers exposed long enough for the crossfire to do its work. Stein kept doing what he'd been doing since the first landing, forcing short pauses in the enemy's fire so someone else could move. He wasn't trying to clear the island by himself. His weapon wasn't a magic wand. It was a tool, one that could create a window. The assault lived or died by windows. At one point, a pocket of Marines ahead was trying to advance along a narrow line of terrain that funneled them into predictable movement. Every time they shifted, fire snapped across the lane. It wasn't random. Someone up the slope was reading their movement and timing shots to catch them the moment they committed. The result was paralysis. Nobody wanted to be the next one to rise. Stein crawled forward until he could get a better angle. He couldn't clearly see the bunker, but he could see the pattern of fire. He adjusted, set the weapon into position, and laid down bursts that forced the enemy to pause. It didn't have to be perfect. It just had to be loud and accurate enough to make the defenders rethink their rhythm. With that pressure, the Marines in the lane moved. First inches, then feet, then a full scramble to the next break in the ground. Stein shifted, advanced behind them, and repeated the process. His improvised gun wasn't meant to be used like a normal squad weapon. It was meant to travel, and he treated it that way. Fire, move, fire again. Always trying to keep the enemy reacting instead of calmly aiming. But the island punished repetition. The longer you stayed alive, the more likely you were to be seen. Stein's runs for ammunition became harder as routes filled with wreckage, smoke, and bodies. On the way back from one resupply, he saw a Marine collapse in the open, wounded and unable to move. People nearby were pinned and couldn't reach him without drawing the same fire. Stein didn't wait for a perfect plan. He put his gun down, sprinted into the exposed area, and grabbed the wounded man by the webbing. The return wasn't clean. It was dragging weight through shifting sand, while bullets cracked overhead. He didn't stop to look heroic. He stopped only when the wounded Marine was behind cover. Then he went right back to the task that kept everyone else moving. The pattern repeated: bursts to suppress, movement to gain ground, and quick decisions to keep men from being left in the open. It was exhausting work, the kind that empties you out even if you never get hit. The gun was heavy. The ammunition was heavier. The island heat and smoke made breathing a chore. And still, Stein kept returning to the front, because every time he did, the line held. By late in the day, parts of the landing force had pushed far enough inland that the fight shifted from beach chaos to fortress assault. That didn't mean it got easier. It became more precise, and in some ways, more terrifying. Instead of random fire from above, Marines were now dealing with strong points they could almost see, only to realize they were facing multiple positions layered behind one another. You could suppress one slit, then another would open from a different angle. You could think you'd pinned a bunker, then fire would resume from a hidden exit 20 meters away. Stein's weapon mattered here too, because it could be moved into angles a heavier setup couldn't reach fast enough. He used it like a lever. Apply force at the right point, create motion elsewhere. When a squad needed to cross an exposed patch, he covered it. When another element needed to reposition, he shifted his fire. When defenders tried to exploit a pause, he was there to answer it with noise and pressure. The men around him started to rely on the rhythm, not because he was invincible, but because his actions created predictability in a place built to destroy it. On a battlefield like Iwo Jima, predictability wasn't comfort, it was survival. As darkness crept closer, the island didn't quiet down. It only changed tones. The smoke thickened. The light became uneven. Shadows made everything harder to identify. But Stein's role didn't change. If anything, it became more important, because confusion at night could freeze units again. Exactly what the defenders wanted. Stein checked his ammunition, listened to the sound of fire, and moved where the pressure was highest. He had built his gun for a problem that training had revealed. Now the island was proving him right. Mobility wasn't just useful. It was the difference between an assault that collapses and one that keeps crawling forward. And he was still crawling forward. Night on Iwo Jima didn't bring rest. It brought a different kind of strain. Less visibility, more uncertainty, and the constant fear that a hidden position would open up the moment someone moved the wrong way. The Marines dug in wherever they could, scraping into the rough ground, building shallow cover that was never as safe as it felt. Somewhere in the dark, defenders shifted, waited, and listened. Stein stayed close to the forward line. He wasn't the type to sit back and hope the next day would be easier. He knew it wouldn't. The only easier on Iwo Jima came from progress. And progress required pressure, steady pressure, so the enemy couldn't reset the fight on their terms. When morning came, it came with the same hard reality. The island was still a fortress. The Marines might have advanced, but they hadn't broken the system of hidden positions and overlapping angles. Every strong point seemed to have a second one watching it. Every approach seemed to be pre-measured for incoming fire. If you moved straight, you were predictable. If you moved cautiously, you were slow. Either way, the defenders had time. Stein's improvised gun was built for this kind of problem. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a method. The method was simple. Keep the defenders reacting. Don't let them settle into an easy rhythm. Don't give them silence long enough to aim calmly, adjust, and punish the next movement. He worked with small groups and whoever happened to be near him. Sometimes it was an organized push. Sometimes it was 2 or 3 Marines trying to get around a piece of terrain that was acting like a wall. If a squad needed to cross an exposed strip, Stein placed his gun so it could cover the line. If another element needed to reposition a few yards, he shifted with them. His role wasn't frontline hero in the movie sense. It was more like a moving brace holding a shaky structure together. At one point, Stein identified a position that had been dominating a section of ground. It wasn't obvious as a bunker at first, just a shape in the terrain that didn't look quite natural. The firing from that area had a pattern. Short, disciplined bursts, timed to catch anyone who tried to crawl forward. It was smart fire. It meant the defenders felt confident there. Stein didn't have the luxury of a perfect view. He chose an angle, steadied the weapon, and laid down bursts that forced the position to pause. Then he shifted the bursts slightly, searching for the point where the enemy's fire would stop. This wasn't blind spraying. It was probing, like testing a lock until you find the part that gives. The pause was enough. Marines nearby used it to move into a better position. When the enemy tried to resume the old pattern, Stein answered again. Eventually, the firing from that point weakened. Not necessarily because the position was destroyed, but because it was being pressured from multiple angles now. That was the goal. On Iwo Jima, you didn't always wipe out a strong point in one clean moment. Sometimes you just forced it into a corner so other teams could finish the job. Another constant was evacuation. The island made moving wounded men brutally difficult, not because of distance, but because every yard could be exposed. Stein kept switching between suppressing fire and helping pull men back. It wasn't a planned rotation. It was need-based. If someone dropped in a bad spot and nobody else could reach him, Stein moved. If an ammo run was needed, Stein ran. If a line needed firepower, Stein fired. The deeper the Marines pushed, the more complex the battlefield became. The beach was behind them now, but the island's interior offered its own traps, angles that made even safe routes suddenly unsafe. The defenders used tunnels to appear where Marines didn't expect, then disappear again before a clear target could be formed. That constant uncertainty is what breaks units over time. You can handle danger when you can see it. It's the invisible danger that eats at you. Stein's approach didn't eliminate uncertainty, but it reduced its power. When he brought his gun forward, it gave Marines something concrete to work with, a plan that included time and space. We move on your bursts. We cross when they duck. We relocate behind that ridge when you suppress that slit. On a battlefield that wanted to turn everything into chaos, even a simple plan felt like oxygen. By now, people had noticed the weapon itself. It looked wrong, too improvised, too mechanical in a way that didn't match standard gear. But it worked. And in war, working matters more than looking right. It gave Stein a presence that didn't come from rank or speeches. It came from results. Still, he wasn't untouchable. Every time he fired, he risked drawing attention. Every time he moved, he risked crossing an unseen line of fire. He survived not because the island spared him, but because he treated exposure like a resource. Spend it only when it buys something real. That second day wasn't about dramatic breakthroughs. It was about grinding forward through a system built to resist. Stein kept grinding, burst by burst, run by run, until the ground in front of him was just slightly less controlled by the enemy than it had been an hour earlier. And on Iwo Jima, slightly less was how victory started. By the time the fight had pushed past the initial landing chaos, the battlefield started to feel like a series of locked doors. Each door was a fortified position, sometimes obvious, sometimes hidden so well it only revealed itself through the angle of incoming fire. The Marines weren't just fighting men anymore, they were fighting a design. A system of tunnels, bunkers, and interlocking kill zones that could hold even when parts of it were damaged. Stein kept moving where the pressure was worst. He wasn't assigned as some special weapon tester. He simply showed up with a tool that solved a problem, and then kept applying it wherever it mattered most. His improvisation wasn't about being clever for its own sake. It was about making the assault function when standard methods got stuck. The terrain forced small unit decisions. A few yards left could mean safety. A few yards right could mean exposure. Communication wasn't clean. Smoke and noise swallowed voices. Hand signals were missed. People got separated, rejoined, then separated again. In that kind of environment, discipline wasn't just following orders. Discipline was keeping your head clear enough to do the next correct action. Stein's gun gave him leverage in those moments. When he arrived at a stalled group, he didn't need a long briefing to understand what was happening. He'd watch for 10 seconds, read the pattern of incoming fire, then place himself where he could change it. Short bursts, precise enough to matter, controlled enough not to waste ammunition, then a shift in position before the enemy could settle in again. A classic problem on Iwo Jima was the false silence. Marines would suppress a bunker, the firing would stop, and the line would start to move, only for fire to erupt from a different angle the moment the unit committed. It wasn't luck, it was design. The defenders wanted Marines to believe a problem was solved so they'd step into the next trap. Stein adapted by treating silence as suspicious. If a position went quiet, he assumed it wasn't gone. It was waiting. So he would keep pressure on it while the squad moved, or he'd shift his gun to cover the likely alternate angle. That kind of thinking doesn't feel heroic. It feels paranoid. But paranoia is sometimes just experience speaking. The longer the assault continued, the more the battle demanded endurance. Adrenaline only carries you so far. After that, you're running on habit and will. Stein's habit was work, fire, move, resupply, repeat. And every loop carried the same risk. A single, well-aimed burst could end him. A single mortar fragment could turn a sprint into a collapse. He knew it. He ran anyway. At some point, the mission stopped feeling like today's landing. It became a longer, uglier reality. This island would be taken only by grinding down a defense that had been engineered to delay and punish. That grind required men who could keep functioning while exhausted. Stein was one of them. During one push, a group ahead was pinned by fire from a position that couldn't be clearly seen. The ground in front was a shallow bowl. Anyone crossing it was exposed from above. The unit needed to cross anyway, because staying put meant being shelled and picked off slowly. Stein moved to an angle where he could fire into the suspected slit. He couldn't confirm the exact opening, but the return fire told him when he was close. He fired controlled bursts, then adjusted slightly, testing the position the way you'd test the weak spot in a wall. The defenders answered at first, then their fire became less consistent. Maybe they were being suppressed, maybe they were shifting, maybe they were wounded. The reason didn't matter. What mattered was the window. He signaled the squad to move. They scrambled across the exposed ground in short, violent bursts of motion, crawl, sprint, drop, each man trying to be smaller than the bullets chasing him. Stein kept firing until the last one reached cover. Then he lifted the gun and moved too. That was the system. No long pauses, no standing still, always buying the next movement. This was also where his weapon's wrongness became an advantage. It didn't match the usual sound profile. It didn't behave like a standard ground gun. In the confusion of combat, anything that breaks expectation can create a moment of hesitation. A moment is enough. But expectation works both ways. The more Stein used the gun, the more the defenders would start to recognize it. The more they recognized it, the more they would focus on the source of that moving fire. Stein began changing his firing rhythm and his positions more aggressively, trying to avoid becoming predictable. He wasn't just suppressing bunkers. He was managing attention. Between pushes, Marines were running out of water, sleep, and patience. Faces were coated with ash and sweat. Hands shook from fatigue. Yet the assault kept moving because it had to. The island offered no safe place to reset. Every delay meant more time under indirect fire, more exposure, more casualties. Stein's contribution wasn't a single dramatic strike. It was the steady reduction of enemy control, turning absolute domination into partial domination, then into contested ground. That sounds small until you realize what it changes. Once ground is contested, squads can maneuver. Once squads can maneuver, strong points can be flanked. Once strong points can be flanked, a fortress starts to crack. And that was the only way Iwo Jima was ever going to break. As the operation continued, Stein's work started to blur into the larger effort around him. That's how intense fighting often feels. You stop seeing a battle and start seeing only the next obstacle, the next ridge, the next slit of fire, the next wounded Marine who needs to be pulled back before the enemy notices movement and corrects their aim. Stein kept his focus narrow on purpose. Thinking too big, trying to hold the entire island in your mind, would crush you. So he thought in meters and seconds. Where is the fire coming from? What lane does it control? How do we break that control long enough to move? The defenders' strongest advantage remained invisibility. Their positions weren't simple sandbags. They were hardened points cut into rock, often with multiple exits. A bunker could go quiet, then reopen from a different angle. A tunnel could let men appear behind a ridge that Marines thought was already secure. This wasn't just stubborn defense, it was engineered defense. Stein's answer stayed the same. Keep them reacting. A reacting enemy is less precise. A reacting enemy makes mistakes. A reacting enemy gives you time. During one particularly difficult phase, a section of the line stalled in front of a fortified area that seemed to command every approach. Attempts to move forward drew immediate fire. Attempts to flank exposed men to a second angle. It felt like the defenders had a solution to every idea. Stein edged forward, using whatever cover he could find, and took a position where he could bring his gun into play, without exposing himself for too long. He fired in short bursts, but not randomly. He aimed at the likely openings, then shifted slightly, reading the response. The goal wasn't to spray the hill. The goal was to force the defenders to duck, to blink, to lose their rhythm. That rhythm break gave another team a chance to reposition. On Iwo Jima, progress often happened like that. One person creates a tiny window, another person uses it, and suddenly a line that looked impossible becomes just barely doable. The system doesn't collapse all at once. It loosens one knot at a time. Stein also understood something else. Casualties weren't just numbers. They were momentum killers. Every time a Marine dropped in a bad spot, several others would risk themselves trying to help. That's how units get pulled into the open. That's how one hit turns into 5. So when he saw men stuck trying to reach a wounded Marine, he didn't wait for an officer's direction. He covered them with fire, then moved to assist if needed. He treated rescue as part of the assault, not as a separate mission. If you don't recover your wounded, your line fractures. If your line fractures, the defenders regain control. His repeated ammo runs became a defining feature of his day. They weren't glamorous. They were logistics under fire. Exactly the kind of thing that rarely gets remembered, but often decides whether a unit can keep functioning. Ammunition is time. Ammunition is pressure. Without it, everything slows down. At one point, Stein's movement caught the attention of more than just the defenders. Marines nearby started using him as a reference point. If Stein was moving forward, it suggested there was a window. If Stein was firing from a certain angle, it suggested that angle mattered. That kind of informal leadership happens naturally under stress. People look for signals that the battlefield is understandable. Stein's actions provided those signals. Still, the danger didn't decrease. If anything, it increased, because the fight shifted into closer, more precise engagements. As Marines approached fortified positions, the distances shrank. The defenders' fire became more targeted. Grenades, rifles, and machine gun bursts were exchanged across short gaps. The sound of battle became sharper, less like distant chaos and more like constant impact. Stein's improvised weapon continued to perform, but the environment tried to destroy it. Volcanic ash gets into everything. It clogs moving parts, grinds metal, ruins lubrication. A weapon that works in clean training conditions can fail quickly in this kind of grit. Stein maintained it as best he could, clearing it when he had seconds, protecting it when he could, and accepting that perfection was impossible. He needed good enough, not factory new. By now, exhaustion was a physical weight. Arms numb from carrying the gun, legs heavy from sprints in unstable ground, eyes burning from smoke and dust. Yet Stein kept showing up where the line needed movement. It's easy to imagine bravery as a single moment, a charge, a shout, a dramatic stand. What Stein demonstrated was a different kind of bravery, repeatable bravery, doing the same dangerous, necessary work again and again, not because it feels heroic, but because the mission depends on it. On Iwo Jima, that kind of bravery was the only kind that lasted. By the later phase of the fight, the Marines had learned a hard truth. The island could not be rushed. It had to be dismantled. Every position was part of a network. When one was suppressed, another would cover it. When one went quiet, it might be waiting, not defeated. The defenders' strength wasn't just courage, it was architecture. Stein's work fit into that dismantling process. He wasn't the only one creating openings, but his ability to carry effective automatic fire into forward positions made him unusually useful in moments when the line threatened to stall. And stalling was deadly. A stalled assault invites artillery. A stalled assault turns into a slow harvest of casualties. During one push, Stein found himself near a group that had advanced slightly ahead of supporting elements. They had cover, but it was thin, and the defenders were beginning to test them with bursts from multiple angles. If the group stayed, they would be pinned and whittled down. If they moved without cover fire, they would be cut apart in the open. Stein took position, fired to suppress one angle, then quickly shifted to cover another. The goal was not to win a duel. It was to prevent the defenders from setting a steady aim point. He was, in effect, interrupting their concentration. That interruption gave the Marines the seconds they needed to reposition into a better, less exposed line. Then the enemy adjusted. They always adjusted. A new firing point opened from a location Stein hadn't been watching. Someone nearby went down. The instinct in most units is to freeze for a heartbeat, because that first casualty feels like a warning shot to the whole group. Stein didn't freeze. He fired to push the new position down, then moved toward the wounded Marine. The rescue wasn't clean. It never is. Terrain shifts under your feet. Gear snags. Smoke hides the safest route. The wounded man can't help you. You drag dead weight while staying low, praying the next burst doesn't walk across you. Stein got him back behind cover. Then he returned to the firing line. This constant switching between roles, gunner, runner, rescuer, was becoming routine for him. It's a strange thing. Under enough stress, even extreme actions can feel normal. Not because they're easy, but because the mind stops labeling them. You just do what the situation demands. As the battle stretched on, Stein's improvised weapon gained a reputation. Marines who had never met him would hear about the aircraft gun being used on the ground. It wasn't the type of story soldiers tell for entertainment. It was a practical story, one that signaled, there's a way through this, if you can keep the pressure moving. But reputation is dangerous too. Anything effective becomes a target. Defenders learn patterns. They watch for the source of the fire that keeps disrupting them. Stein responded by changing his position often and avoiding long, predictable firing sequences. He treated every burst like a flare. It lights you up. The longer you burn, the more likely someone aims a heavier response at you. At some point, Stein and the Marines around him were tasked with dealing with a particularly stubborn position that had resisted multiple attempts to neutralize it. The area was wired into the island's defensive system, covered by other positions, and difficult to approach without being seen. It was exactly the kind of strong point that could stall an entire section for hours. Stein moved forward with his gun, not to destroy the position outright, but to enable others to get close enough to do the job. He fired into the likely openings, forcing defenders to duck. Another team used the distraction to shift into a better angle. The defenders answered with bursts, but the pattern was broken. The locked door began to loosen. In battles like this, even a small change matters. When a strong point goes from confidently firing to firing in panic, it stops controlling space. When it stops controlling space, Marines can maneuver. When Marines can maneuver, the strong point becomes vulnerable. Stein kept working until his body was running on empty. He had already pushed beyond the usual limits, physical and mental. But the mission didn't care about limits. The mission cared about the next yard. By late in the fight, the accumulation of his actions was clear, not as a single dramatic moment, but as a chain of openings, created and used. He had helped move the line forward. He had helped keep wounded Marines from being left behind. He had helped maintain the pressure that prevents a fortified defense from resetting and recovering. That's what it looked like when one person's improvisation and endurance met a battlefield designed to break both. And he was still not finished. When people talk about extraordinary actions in war, they often focus on one highlight, one charge, one burst of courage, one moment that looks cinematic from a distance. What made Stein's day different was that it wasn't a single highlight. It was a chain of hard choices repeated under the same brutal conditions until repetition itself became the story. By the end of his actions on Iwo Jima, Stein had done the kind of work that keeps an assault from collapsing. He moved firepower forward, he kept ammunition flowing, he helped recover wounded Marines, and he created openings that other squads could turn into real progress. The battlefield didn't reward any of this with comfort. It rewarded it only with the chance to keep moving. In the days that followed, the fighting on Iwo Jima continued in the same grinding way. Positions dismantled one by one, tunnel networks searched, strong points reduced with method and sacrifice. It was never clean. It was never simple. And it demanded a type of endurance that most people never have to imagine. Stein's improvised weapon, built from aircraft components and field-made supports, became a symbol of something deeper than cleverness. It represented adaptation under pressure, the idea that when standard solutions fail, survival often depends on someone who can build a new one fast enough to matter. His actions were later recognized at the highest level. But even that recognition doesn't fully capture what the day felt like in real time. The ash in your mouth, the constant concussion of impacts, the uncertainty of where the next burst will come from, the weight of the gun and ammo, and the split-second decisions that decide whether other Marines move or stay pinned. If there's a lesson in the story, it isn't that one person can win a battle alone. It's that one person can change the shape of a moment, and moments are how battles are won. A 10-second pause in enemy fire can save lives. A short burst at the right time can move a squad. A resupply run can keep a line from folding. A rescue can keep a unit from breaking apart emotionally and tactically. Stein didn't invent courage on that beach. Courage was everywhere. What he added was a method for turning courage into motion. And that may be the most important difference between bravery and impact. Bravery is the will to act, but impact is acting in a way that changes what others are able to do next. In the end, the island was taken, but it was taken by thousands of such linked actions. The story of one Marine with an improvised gun stands out because it shows how problem-solving and determination can exist inside chaos, not outside it. It shows how a tool, built with stubborn practicality, can become a lifeline. If you're watching this now, remember what that kind of battlefield demanded. Not perfect plans, not perfect gear, but relentless execution under conditions designed to strip people down to fear and fatigue. The men who kept moving did so because they found a way to keep pressure alive. That's what Tony Stein did. And that's why his story still hits hard today. because it isn't about fantasy. It's about what happens when a human being refuses to let the situation decide the outcome without a fight.